Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Well, this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. ASA has a fantastic committee. They work very, very hard. They do anything they can to support animal studies scholars. So I really encourage you to think about becoming a member of ASA. Membership is just $50 Australian and $25 for the unwaged. So that's ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Well, this week I'm really lucky to be able to bring you a conversation with someone who I've been wanting to interview for at least the past 6 months. So I met this person at the Minding Animals conference in Mexico, and we didn't have the opportunity to do an interview then, but she's been visiting in Australia. I've heard her speak a couple of times now. I've been absolutely blown away with her scholarship. So I'm really lucky to be joined this week by Nekeisha Alayna Alexis. Did I do that correctly?
Yes, you
Not
did.
too
Thank
bad.
you.
Now, Nekeisha is an independent scholar, and today we're going to discuss her upcoming book chapter, Beyond Compare, Intersectionality and Interspeciesism for Co-Liberation with Other Animals, and that's going to appear in the Routledge Handbook of Animal Ethics. The handbook should be out very soon at the time you're hearing this, and it's edited by Bob Fischer. Welcome to the podcast, Nekeisha.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk with you.
Okay, so why this chapter? What inspired it?
So I met Bob Fischer at a Animals in the Kingdom of God conference. It was the 10th anniversary of that series that took place at Calvin College. And Bob, who is at a university in Texas, he presented and I presented also there, and presented some work on intersectionality and other animals, how we think about so-called human concerns and notice the animal component to it. So thinking about slaughterhouses was one example where, of course, we're concerned very much with what's happening to other animals, but also how do we think through the humane condition or the inhumane conditions that workers go through, and how we, in thinking about those things together, how that might change the way we do activism. That there are ways of thinking about humans and animals for co-liberation, for better spaces for all of us. And so Bob was excited about my talk there and was working on this handbook for Routledge and asked if I would do a chapter on intersectionality. So I a little bit reluctantly, I was like, I don't know if I can add another thing to my life right now, but he really wanted that voice to be included, and so I was able to take that on, and I'm glad with how it came out. Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. So I think the expression intersectionality has certainly been floating around in animal studies scholars and activist scholars circles for a while now, but it's quite possible there are some listeners who either don't know the expression or are a little bit unsure about what it means. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us what intersectionality is?
Right. So credit for the naming of this. I think it's something that people have thought about for a long time. But the coining of the phrase and the popularizing of it is due to Kimberly Crenshaw, black scholar, lawyer in the U.S., and it comes out of one of her essays, demarginalizing. I think it's demarginalizing the intersection. I can't remember the full title, but she was looking very specifically at the legal system in the U.S. and its ways of dealing with black women's bringing of suits around discrimination. And so the way that the legal system is set up in the U.S., you either have to make a claim based on race, that I'm being discriminated against based on race, or I'm being discriminated on based on my gender. And for Black women, of course, they were being discriminated on both. And so in these various cases, there were ways in which they were either denied bringing both claims, or their opponents could say, well, look, we hire Black men, we hire white women. Of course, there's no discrimination happening. And Kimberly noticed this gap in the legal system and theorized that there are peculiar and particular kinds of oppression that happen when you are in two, and she increased to more social categories at the same time. So that being the intersection, of course, is if you're standing in the intersection of a road and you get hit by a car in the intersection, what road were you hit on, right? And so the ambulance coming to sort of see you, and well, we can only pick you up if you get hit on the race road or the gender road, and you happen to be in the intersection. Just the ways that our frameworks don't actually provide recourse for particular people within our societies. And since that essay, people, of course, have added more lanes to the intersection, if you will, around sexuality, around class, around age, around ability. And so I think intersectionality, when it's used the best, is about trying to identify how oppression is happening and the ways in which we are to work politically and socially to challenge that. So,
now you note in your article that animal advocates have, of course, been drawing comparisons and liking some of the ways in which we harm animals with some of the ways in which we harm humans. But you take a critical look at that work. Can you say something about how you see, or the problematic ways in which you see animal advocates drawing comparisons?
Sure. So there are a number of other scholars who have also pointed to this. So I think I'm naming something that's not necessarily new, but for the purpose of this handbook, really envisioning graduate students reading it, and I wrote it trying to give people some clarity about when you're doing comparing and when you're doing intersectionality, because sometimes they can seem similar. Sometimes you're looking at similar cases like race and animals, for example, but there are different ways of doing it. So with the comparison, it's resting on the victims being the same. Here are people here are bunnies in a cage. Here are slaves in a slave ship. This is the same, and so this is why we need to fight it. And there are ways that there are multiple ways that this, of course, doesn't work. Some of it has to do with the fact that individuals within a group suffer different from one another, and groups suffer different from one another. So in the work of animal studies and critical animal work, I think we need to get to the point where we can also embrace diversity and see diversity and difference as vital, and difference as not a reason to exploit. So there's something that's very flattening, that doesn't really honor the ways that animals and individual animals suffer within particular conditions, possibly sometimes in ways that are more extreme than humans because of heightened senses of smell, or heightened sensitivity in terms of what can be felt. So it's not doing justice to the animals. It's certainly not doing justice to the individual humans and the groups of humans that are also caught within their respective systems. I highlight the slavery comparison. There are other really terrible ones that are made, but it just breaks down on so many levels. So one of the examples that I give in the essay is an environmental blogger, Jim Matavali, I think is how you say his last name. He writes this article. It's a very sensational title, Meet the Slavery of Our Time. The whole article goes through. There's no mention of slavery again until the last paragraph, where it's like, and just as whoever we is, are all appalled by slavery, whoever we is, will all be appalled by eating other animals. And it's like, okay, well, one, whoever the we is not all appalled by slavery. Like, we actually have modern day examples of not necessarily Middle Passage type slavery, I want to be clear, but the kinds of working conditions that fall under that category, whether it's child slavery in mines collecting chocolate, or we have very clear examples. We have clear examples of auctioning. So the one kind of example that I give too is in Libya, where people really were being sold into, refugees were being sold into work. So actually, no, we aren't settled, whoever we is, that slavery is a bad thing. So what kind of slavery are you talking about? And also, the end of slavery hasn't really meant the end of anti-blackness. It hasn't meant the end of the system. Has certainly is. I don't ever want to say that it's that's the end of slavery hasn't changed anything. That's not my point. But what it has changed, we can't overestimate the things that it has changed. And so there's a lot about that comparison that just factually is incorrect. And then there are other things too, in the sense that it's so disingenuous all the time, because if your organization or whoever was making these comparisons really cared about the end of slavery, they would be figuring out a way how to care about animals and Black people. And very rarely do you see organizations come out in support of Black Lives Matter. Very rarely do you see, it happens, but rarely do you see animal organizations showing up at the rallies against police brutality, etc. So, people of color, Black people, we're not stupid. We know when we're being used, generally, and it's not a wonder that it's so offensive to people, because I don't want to be a prop for your cause. Like, there's already ways in which I'm being marginalized in society, and I don't want to then be tacked on to the cause of other animals. And that is a fraught relationship for Black people, because we have been constructed as animals, animal-like, and have a history and a present of being treated in that way. So in addition to it being like just false, it's also coming from a place that's disingenuous, and it also doesn't honor the particular types of suffering that's happening. And honestly, it's not necessary. So AFCO and Silco, in their book Afroism, they talk about really what we need to be naming is the logic and the source of this problem that is manifesting itself in different ways against everybody who's not a white male heterosexual person who is classed, et cetera, et cetera. And so the comparisons actually don't, if you see a bunny in a cage and you see a slave on a slave ship and you're not identifying the source of why these things are happening, people might feel bad about it, but it's not undoing the real root causes of things. So, I could say more stuff, but comparison, just stop. There's not a real good reason to do it.
So, Nekeisha, thank you. That's a very, very sophisticated and sensitive explanation of an issue that I think a lot of people are trying to get their head around and make sense of, particularly, as you say, because it has been happening for so long, right? The imaging and all the rest of it. Do you see any organizations doing intersectionality well?
So some of the folks that I follow, Food Empowerment Project, they're very good at challenging, like vegans and non-vegans too, to be thinking about their relationships to other animals and to humans. So one of the things that I really appreciate about them is they have, for example, and this seems simple, but it's not, like a vegan chocolate list that doesn't involve child exploitation. So it's helpful for us to be thinking, like, what do we mean about cruelty-free as people who are concerned with the exploitation of other animals? But they also do work with migrants as well. So their backpack drive for the children of migrants, in addition to their work speaking out about farmed animals and moving for a veganic future. So there's a lot of stuff that they do, or at least I witness as someone following them, that's tackling this kind of the interconnectedness of violence that happens when we're exploiting other beings and exploiting people who we have othered as well. I think Vine Sanctuary is another group that I follow, and that they're of course providing sanctuary for other animals, but very attuned to other issues and speaking out against that, and also showing support, whether it's for LGBTQ folks or for Black liberation as well. I did notice something interesting, and I don't know why this came about. I would not say that Mercy for Animals is intersectional by any means, but even at their level, they used to get very excited about workers that were punished. Like, here's somebody who went to jail, and, aren't we so glad that all of this cruelty is being stopped? Without saying anything at all about the conditions that the workers were under. So even they have gotten a bit smarter about saying, like, and this is terrible conditions for everybody. Again, not trying to claim that they're intersectional, but I think even some of the mainstream people are kind of getting a little bit the problematics of not attending to the full scope of violence within any of the systems that they're critiquing. Those are the ones that are coming to mind. I know that there are others for sure. Grow Where You Are too is, again, these are all people that I follow. A Black-run farming that's vegan, and they do community work as well, and they're being very clear about race and the necessity of Black people to be caring for their health, to be caring for their land, to have access to their food, and also to be caring for other animals as a part of that. So there are different organizations that are getting at that, but a lot of the big ones just continue to engage in the same. I mean, they think it's shocking, it's shorthand, they want to get people's attention right away, but really what it continues to do is it might get some people's attention, but it's keeping other folks from entering into the conversation and remaining suspicious of the conversation, and they should. Like, I don't want to join anything that's going to throw me up as a sacrifice just because it's convenient and because it works.
Fascinating. Well, Nekeisha, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I can do that, yes.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yes. So I can say I went to Wake Up Weekend. I always tell this story because I have to give credit where credit is due. Wake Up Weekend at Calvin College in Grand Rapids, I believe is in 2007. And just that was the place that I encountered, all of the videos that you could imagine, but also really amazingly spirited people sharing their stories about caring for other animals. And so it was out of that conference that I began to move towards veganism and animal liberation as core to who I am and what I want to do. And I happened to be at an Easter vigil with the monks in Michigan. I'm totally blanking on the name of the place. I apologize. I'll send you the name. You could include it. And so we had worship together and brought in the coming of Easter, and we were breaking the fast with the monks. And Brianne Donaldson, former student at the seminary or graduate of the seminary where I also attended, she was there and gave me a copy of The Sexual Politics of Meat and said, I think you should read this. And of course, I was already transformed by the stuff that I witnessed and the people I had met. And that book also gave me another angle for why this was so important and meaningful also for myself as a woman in the world. So that would be the first thing that I could remember. Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Okay, so I couldn't recall it, but I did look up my CV before this, and in 2008, I wrote a short article for the Mennonite Church women's magazine. It's called Timbrel Magazine, and it's called Caring for Creation One Bite at a Time. And I opted to take I was writing about veganism in the context of creation care because that's a lot of the discourse that's used within my denomination. And so I see it, I'd have to reread it, but I see it as a pro-animal text and also a way of trying to bring animal causes into spaces wherever I could. So I consider that one of my first pro-animal text.
Wonderful. If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
I have to say Carol Adams again with that. I've had the opportunity to meet her on a few occasions, and I'm not sure that a lot of people know this, but she is a woman of faith, or at least when at last I encountered her, she went to seminary as well and wrote a book of prayers related to other animals. And so, the fact that her work really strongly helped me, I think, stay vegan. And also, I've just had these encounters with her in different spaces in Sweden, at Grand Rapids, recently again at Mexico City. And yeah, it's another woman of faith who is working and who has had a lot of influence in this field as well. So I appreciate that. I'm sure there are other people, but I'm just going to give her that shout out.
Great. So what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
I think continuing to figure out how to translate the work that we are doing into broader spaces. Sometimes my life feels a little bit more than bifurcated because I'm doing theology over here, I'm doing activist work or community work here, I'm writing and doing scholarly work, etc. And something that I'm always doing in my writing is like trying very much to make it accessible. I will change words, in my editing process and be like, okay, this is the word that I'm thinking, but if I want like my mom or somebody else to be able to read it, this is the word that will work better. So it's definitely not a request to be anti-intellectual at all, but there are so many people on the ground that I encounter that are not a part of these conversations. And so how do we continue to figure out how to bring the conversations to other people, to be wide in who we consider our audience to be? And, I think that means writing in different venues, the scholarly venues, the magazine venues, the interview format, etc. I was thinking about this this morning, actually, I woke up at 5:55 in the morning and just had like a sort of like, that's like the epiphany noise. And, we were talking in these conferences that we've been at about a lot of energy. How do we work with the environmental movement, or how do we get the environmental movement to take people who are talking about other animals seriously? It seems like a natural fit. But it dawned on me like, why aren't we as like eager or imagining like anti-racism spaces as also places where we if the environmental movement doesn't want us, like the anti-racist spaces might be another really ideal place to go, because species is so much a part of that. So what would it mean for a lot of animal scholars to be submitting papers to conversations or conferences or workshops about diversity or about race? I think it would be kind of a little bit of a hard slog, but that's also another avenue that makes total sense, and that might have more openings for us as well. So I think those are two things that I would say. And also keep making our work real. Like we need to be connected to other animals so they don't become totally theoretical.
Well, if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I think the first thing is we need a moratorium on violence. We just need to stop killing other creatures. I had a really interesting conversation with one of the professors at the seminary where I work, and I can't remember all the details about it, but we were kind of maybe going back and forth a little bit about whether animals have souls or something like that. And, I said something along the lines of, well, we should stop killing them at least until we know for sure. Right? Like that there's something about saying, regardless of what you think or what questions you have, or if you're sure or not sure, every time we destroy an individual, they're gone. So while you're trying to figure out your questions about whether animals are going to heaven, or whether animals are loved by God in the same way, or, whether your canine teeth are really canine teeth and what to do about them, like, can we stop destroying individuals at the very very least? I'm sure I could say, like, let's have the peaceable kingdom come right now, like lions and tigers and humans laying together, like. But I think, I'm trying to be both ideal and also somewhat realistic. Like, let's just stop killing, and the humans hash out all of our questions and let animals do what they need to do in the meantime, I guess. I don't know.
Sounds like a good idea. Well, Nekeisha, what are you working on next?
I don't. I'm working on maybe not working. I probably will take a short break in 2019. But I have ideas around working with hip hop and other animals, like finding the ways that other animals come into that genre of communication, and as a way of saying, a lot of times people are like, how do we get black people to be involved in this or black people to be involved in that? And I feel like I've come across other animals coming up in hip-hop songs, and even if they're not coming up necessarily in the same way that I'm thinking about them, the artists themselves might not be vegan. Like, I think there's material within that form of communication and discourse and art that the animals that do come up can be the starting point. So rather than trying to figure out how to import some other communication or some other art or some other mode of quote unquote convincing other people, is there source material within this medium that there are a lot of black people who appreciate that other animals are appearing and can be teased out what that means. So that's kind of the project that's most on my mind right now.
Sounds amazing. So where can people find out more about your work?
That part's a little tricky. I'm not terribly on social media, but I will probably get on Twitter after this episode. But I think if people Google my name, Nekeisha Alayna Alexis, there will be ways in which they can find me, and I'll be sure to point to other clearer pathways when they emerge.
Wonderful. Well, look, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Now, you can follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals. We're also on Facebook at Knowing Animals. And finally, don't forget to leave a review on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for other people to find us. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.